This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 60 is Jungian analyst and lecturer Dr. Mark Saban in Oxford, England. He earned his undergraduate degree in classics from Pembroke College at the University of Oxford, and recently completed his Ph.D. in Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic studies at the University of Essex, where his supervisors were noted Jungian scholars Roderick Main and Matt ffytche. He worked for 20 years as a performer and writer in theater, television, and film, appearing in the TV series The Les Dennis Laughter Show and Berkeley Square, and in the movies Privileged and Shakespeare in Love. He later went on to train as a Jungian analyst with the independent group of Analytical Psychologists in London. He is currently a senior Jungian analyst, registered with the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy and the International Association for Analytical Psychology. He works as a lecturer in Jungian and post-Jungian studies in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex in England. In 2017, he was a panelist at the historic Who is My Jung conference at the British Library in London. It was the first time all 5 London societies with IAAP-accredited training programs came together. Dr. Saban has published numerous papers and book chapters, and is co-editor of Analysis and Activism, Social and Political Contributions of Jungian Psychology, along with fellow Jungian analysts Amelia Keel and Andrew Samuels. It was nominated for a Gradiva Award for Best Edited Book, and was a finalist for the American Board and Academy of Psychoanalysis Book Prize. His book chapters include Ambiguating Jung in How and Why We Still Read Jung, Personal and Professional Reflections, edited by Jean Kirsch and Murray Stein, and Science Friction, Jung, Goethe, and Scientific Objectivity in Jung and the Question of Science, edited by Rhea A. Jones. Two Souls, Alas, Jung's Two Personalities and the Making of Analytical Psychology was the 2019 Zurich Lecture Series at the International School of Analytical Psychology. Based on his Ph.D. thesis, the book was later published by Chiron. That book and more are the subjects of our talk today. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, April 15th, 2020, through the magic of Skype. Hi, Dr. Saban.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm just thinking. I'm getting quite used to this remote chatting. Having to, under present circumstances, having to talk to all my clients via Skype or Zoom or whatever, and even my teaching at the university is being done that way now. So this has become the new norm.
The new norm, yes. And I was going to ask you how things are where you are, and during this very unusual time, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us for this episode.
Yeah, not at all. I'm very pleased to be able to do it. I mean, the answer to your question is that things are very quiet.
Yeah.
And one gets to enjoy the bird song and the sounds of spring in a way that I can't remember having done for a while. Because I live kind of in the city of Oxford, but it doesn't feel like a city at the moment.
Things are quiet, yes, and I live in Chicago, and things are rather quiet here too. And I also notice the birds, although, and there's downtown Chicago for you. Although it snowed overnight, and it's still snowing now. So,
wow.
Yeah, I always say that it snows at least once every April. So before we get to your book, I wanted to ask you about the training programs in London. You trained with the independent group. And
Sure.
Yeah, and London is kind of unique in that it has 5 different societies with IAAP accredited training programs. And I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean this could get very complicated and very boring, so I'll try and keep it simple. But it is quite interesting in a way, because it tells us something about the history of Jungian, the Jungian world over the last 60 odd years. Because the originally there was only one training in London, and that was set up by Michael Fordham. And from the very beginning, it was there was a big influence from the psychoanalytic side, especially from the object relations aspect of things. So people like Melanie Klein and Donald Winnicott and so on were their thinking was incorporated into the teaching with the Society of Analytical Psychology, as the organization was known, right from the very beginning. And so the so-called London school, from very early on, was inflected by this highly developmental aspect of psychology. But what happened was that people would also wanted to train in Zurich, so people would go and train in Zurich in a more classical way, and then they'd come back to Britain, and they'd want to belong to the organisation. But there was a tension between the way they'd been taught about Jungian stuff and the way that the people who had trained in London had been taught, and there was friction between these two different ways to approach Jung, and eventually there was a split, as these things tend to happen, and the Association of Jungian Analysts was formed. And then after a little while, the same thing happened again, except that somebody split off of the Association of Jungian Analysts, and that was the independent group of analytical psychologists, the people that I trained with. And they were sort of even further on the spectrum, away from the developmental end and in the direction of the more archetypal end. And by now, people like James Hillman were beginning to have an influence. And so there were certain people in that training who were interested in that end of things. And then there are a couple of other trainings which have developed. One which originally felt, I think, that there wasn't enough emphasis on the spiritual, so that became the Guild of Analytical Psychology, as it's now known. And then I think the other training you're referring to, I can't remember the name of it exactly, but it was quite similar to the Society of Analytical Psychology, with the up the developmental end. So what it means in effect is that the whole range of Jungian thinking is represented across these different organizations and these different trainings. Mm-hmm. And I mean, just to bring myself in there, the reason I chose to train with the independent group was because I came to Jung having through a kind of Hillman direction. So I read a lot of James Hillman before I even started reading Jung, and I was fascinated by that aspect of Jungian thinking, and so I looked out for a training that would represent that aspect of things. But I mean, it's interesting because, I finished my training, well, getting on for 20 years ago. And I perhaps now wish that I'd had a training that was not exactly more developmental, but included certain things that were rather unrepresented in the training I did, such as an interest in transference and countertransference. So, everybody develops in the way they do, but I think the kind of friction between these different organizations, luckily, in recent years, has diminished quite a lot. And you mentioned in your intro there that there was this event where all five came together. It's rather like something out of The Godfather. The five families came together, right. and we were polite enough to each other to be able to listen to each other for a little while. And I think on the whole that the huge differences in approach have diminished a lot in recent years. And I think we're all much better at listening to the other groups.
Would you tell us a little bit about that conference? It was called Who is My Jung? And you spoke, the title of your talk was Inside Out, Jung's Myth of Interiority, a Conundrum. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it was an interesting idea for a conference. I think that people would come, people with some history and experience in the Jungian world would come and talk about which Jung was their inspiration, I suppose. Mm-hmm. That'd be one way to put it. And I think that itself is quite an interesting way to approach things, because, and this is something I bring out in the book, or try to, which is that we all have, it's the essence of the idea of individuation, which I take to be the central notion in Jung psychology. It's the central idea of that is that we all become who we are. That's the goal, and that's going to be different in every case, and the way in which we do that will be different in every case. That itself is slightly in tension with a psychology which was so closely based and derived from Jung's own experiences and the way Jung saw things. So there's always going to be this slightly difficult tension between taking on the way Jung saw things and accepting his way of seeing things, and somehow developing one's own individual way of seeing things. I think that's a particularly interesting tension right at the heart of Jungian psychology.
Yes.
So in a way, the conference drew attention to the fact that we all have different Jungs, and that's something to be celebrated. And if we can all come and talk to each other about it, then that's great, and we can all be open to other people's Jungs as well. To come back to another central idea in Jung, the idea of his first the first book he published after his split with Freud was on psychological types, and there he was very much drawing attention to the fact that everybody sees the world in a different way. And it's absolutely essential, if you're working with clients or if you're just in the world with people, that you recognize that they're not going to be seeing things in exactly the way you see things. So that sort of aspect of things is always really crucial. In the particular paper that I delivered there, I was looking at something which it was a sort of early version of something that I then wrote up more fully in the book, mm-hmm. Which is looking at the way in which Jung's outer relationships with people, and especially in that particular talk, I was looking at his relationships with various women in his life, had in fact played a crucial part in terms of the development of his psychology. Those experiences had really been important. But it felt to me as if he hadn't necessarily always acknowledged the extent to which these outer relationships were crucial in the development of the psychology. With Jung, there's always a tendency, if not a bias, in the direction of the inner world. And so his inner development tends to take priority. So if you read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his memoir, he starts about saying, the only thing, this is not going to be a history of all the important people I met and all the places I went to. It's a story about my inner world and the development of my inner world. And that emphasis tends to mean that he downplays the importance of his relationships, outer relationships with people, including these women. And as I say, it felt to me important to acknowledge that these women had been important, and B, to acknowledge that the outer world could be just as fruitful, psychologically speaking, as the inner world.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to the book a little later. I just wanted to ask you about some of the other book contributions you've made. There is a book called How and Why We Still Read Jung.
Mm.
Yeah, and would you tell us a little bit about how and why we still read Jung?
Well, I suspect, I mean, coming back to what I've just said, we're all drawn to Jung for different reasons. We all read him for different reasons, and we all find different things in Jung. And again, that's a strength really in the field in many ways. But it means that sometimes it's not necessarily easy for us to talk to each other.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if you found. I mean, you've done. This is. Did you say this is number 60 of your interviews? I mean, you must have come across some pretty contrasting versions of Jung in that time.
I have, and I would just like to add that that's what this podcast is for. I want analysts to come on here and talk about themselves and their work and their training and their lives and why they're interested in Jung. And I'm not here to debate anybody or criticize anybody. And, there's so much of that on social media, comments and disagreements. Yep. And I'm not interested in that. We all see things through our lens, our perspective, our history. And I'm open to all of it. Nope, I don't think anybody's right or wrong if you are being true to what you see and, what your experience was. That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think that's so. I mean, to come back to your question in terms of why and how we read Jung, I think that. I mean, what I was particularly interested in the piece that I wrote for that was the way in which Jung himself, it seemed to me, shouldn't be approached as being a single thing. So there isn't in a way one Jung there. Not only are we all coming to Jung in all sorts of different ways, but Jung himself. Was multiple in many ways, and I particularly drew attention. The name of the chapter I wrote was ambiguating Jung. I was particularly interested in the way in which Jung emphasizes the importance of ambiguity. There's a particular letter where he says that he always tries to write as ambiguously as possible, and the reason for that is because he thinks that's the only way to authentically talk about the psyche, because the psyche is that it's like that. The psyche is always ambiguous,
right?
And I think that's an incredibly rich notion. But I then looked more closely at the ways in which Jung often leaves open, as it were, other ways to approach anything he's saying. So he very rarely lays down the law, in a dogmatic way about anything. He'll nearly always leave the door open for some other approach there as well. And sometimes these are almost opposing approaches. I mean, people often say when reading the collected works of Jung, well, you can find Jung saying one thing in one place and almost the opposite somewhere else, which is absolutely true. But it seems to me that, again, that's a kind of strength, that because he's allowing for this huge richness of ambiguity.
Yes.
I mean, in fact, that idea, and I looked there at, and one of the sources for that chapter was the first 3 chapters of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where Jung talks specifically about his early years and how he felt that he had 2 personalities. And that seemed to me to be a very early place where he's acknowledging that there are these 2 sides to him, and how important it was to pay attention to both sides. So that was really the kind of seed for what eventually came out in the book years later. That was the beginning of that process of thinking in those ways.
Mm-hmm. And the title of the book contains a quote by Goethe, "Two souls, alas." Would you tell us a little bit about why you chose that?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I just couldn't. I mean, Jung himself was very. I mean, as again he says in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, was a reader of Goethe from very young. Mm-hmm. I think any educated German speaker in Jung's day, and probably even now, would be well acquainted with the works of Goethe, who was obviously a giant in the literary field. But it's interesting because in the English-speaking world, Goethe is one of these people who people often say is untranslatable. People obviously have translated Goethe into English, but somehow the magic doesn't come over. Right. As a result, I think the English-speaking world is just not very well acquainted with Goethe. But for Jung, he was absolutely crucial, and especially this huge two-part dramatic poem, Faust, which he wrote some of fairly early in his life, and then the second part of much later in his life. And Jung was absolutely fascinated by this poem. But anyway, this comes quite early in the storyline, and Faust himself is expressing the fact that he feels that he has, alas, as he says, two souls in his breast, and one of these souls is very much concerned with the kind of everyday life and the ordinary existence of an ordinary person, and the other is one could say more concerned with spiritual matters and is sort of facing upwards, as it were. And I'm sure that when Jung was writing about having these two personalities, he certainly had at the back of his mind this notion in Goethe. I mean, I'm sure Goethe himself didn't invent it. It's in some ways it's a sort of commonplace that we have. There's such a thing as inner conflict, obviously. But I think Goethe takes it a little bit further, and then Jung obviously really runs with it in this very late work of his, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he recounts how difficult it was for him to have to deal with these quite contrasting, conflicting aspects of himself.
Right. Well, tell us about that. I mean, Jung sort of discovered that within himself at an early age.
Yes, he did. He did indeed, and he became aware of the fact that there was, as he described. I mean, he in Memories and Reflections he calls them personality number one and personality number two. Mm-hmm. Not very imaginatively, really, but personality number one for Jung was very much himself as an ordinary little boy, and a boy who was didn't do his homework and got told off and just got on with things and went to school and had relationships with his parents and so on and so forth. But he was aware of this other personality within him, and he describes it in all sorts of ways. It seems to have been closely connected to certain rather extraordinary experiences he had when he was quite young. One of which was a dream he had where he went down into an underground cellar and saw a sort of enormous phallus on a throne there, and there were other experiences. There was one where he sat on a stone. He used to sit on a stone as a little boy and wonder whether he was the person sitting on the stone or whether he was the stone being sat on. And there were various other experiences he had, which he kind of secreted away. He had this strong sense of there being a kind of secret inner world that he never told anyone about. In some cases, he didn't tell anyone about them until he wrote this memoir when he was in his 80s or whatever. And it felt very important to him to have this world that somehow was separate from the normal world of his ordinary life. And that then developed, as he got older, into an awareness of what he called God's world. And he didn't mean the kind of Christian God, which was a God he found himself being disappointed by Christianity, not really feeling that was properly expressing this inner thing that he felt, a sense of numinosity, this word that Jung loves to use, a sense that the world is huge and awful and much bigger and more dangerous and and more exciting than one can contain, really. This awareness of that world, which was something that he found it very difficult to express to anybody else. Mm-hmm. And he picked it up originally, this idea of two personalities, interestingly, from his mother, because he says his mother, who was a woman who certainly had mental health problems when she was a mature woman, and she used to, and to the extent that she actually had to go away and for sometimes weeks at a time into mental health places to recover and so on, and obviously that affected Jung. His mother was there one day and not there the next day, but he was aware when his mother was there that she had two different personalities, as he described it. One again was the ordinary, loving mother that he was used to, but at night, he says, she turned into something quite different, this rather uncanny figure who was absolutely different. And I think that this sort of set the stage in a way for his own awareness of this difference within himself between these two figures. But the important, I could talk a lot about all the different ways that this showed up in Jung, but for me, the important aspect of this was what he did with it, because he tried to live either in one personality or the other. And when he tried to live in personality number one, he felt that didn't work. It was too flat. It was too ordinary. There was something missing. But when he tried to live in personality number two, the one that was in God's world, as it were, then it was as if he disappeared, as if he got sucked into this huge, wider world. And he also realized that he couldn't really continue and develop as a person in the world if he was in that world. Mm-hmm. So he eventually came to the conclusion that he needed to allow for and pay attention to both of these aspects of himself and allow both of them to be there. He had to live through personality number one in terms of he had, to having relationships, getting jobs, getting educated, getting out there in the world, and so on. And that was important, and he had to do that. But he wanted to make sure that he never betrayed personality number two, that was somehow always there for him as well. Mm-hmm. So the two could somehow live together within him. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be an absolutely crucial awareness in Jung. Which then, to come back to your question, this issue of the opposites in Jung, mm-hmm. In Jungian psychology, which is this rather difficult topic. Jung is often. It's hard to read anything in Jung where he doesn't mention at some point what he calls the problem of the opposites. And it's not always very clear what he means by that or how that plays out. But it seems to me that the kind of crucial early experience that Jung recounts in Memories, Dreams, Reflections gives us some idea of what he's talking about. That he needed to live these opposites, these opposite personalities somehow. He needed to allow them to be in contact with each other. And if he could do that, then he could move on. He could develop, and to use the word that he then himself developed to describe what he was talking about, he could individuate. Mm-hmm. And individuation for Jung is always involves this question of bringing the opposites together, as he calls it, allowing them into tension with each other, so that this third thing can emerge. And that sometimes sounds a little bit mystical or a little bit irrational or mysterious, really. But I think that in effect, what he means is that we live our contradictions, and we allow these sometimes difficultly different aspects of ourselves to work together. And however hard that may be, and I think it is difficult, that's the recipe for being able to move on and renew ourselves, as it were.
So Jung recognized this in himself at a very young age, and possibly because he saw it in his mother, he was able to see it in himself as well. I'm wondering, do we all have this?
Yeah, well, I think that's an important question, and Jung is in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Jung is very clear about this. He says because he can tell already that if he starts talking about himself having had two personalities, loads of people are going to jump in and say, well, Jung was clearly bonkers from an early age and suffered from some sort of dissociation, and this is probably some form of schizophrenia, and so on and so forth. And indeed, he was quite right, because Winnicott wrote a famous review of Memories, Dreams, Reflections where he said exactly that. However, Jung himself makes it perfectly clear when he talks about this in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that he's not talking about something pathological here, and that he believes that this is something that we all share. In other words, it's something that just comes with being human. But I mean, it's not immediately apparent why that should be the case, or that is the case, because we certainly don't all experience having two personalities in the way that Jung describes it, and or even and the specific ways in which Jung's two personalities show up is certainly not common. I would think. Okay. So what does he mean by that? And my answer to that is that. What he means is that as life itself always involves us coming up against the other, something that is, there's a tendency for us all to become one-sided, to play to our strengths, to develop, to fall in the direction that we're already falling, just to become more of the same, to stay in the kind of safe zone that we know. And what's required is for individuation, is for the other to allow the other in, as it were. And so the other is the other personality in this case. I think the way in which Jung experienced probably was very unusual. So, I mean, certainly not the case that we all experience it in that way. But when he says that's something that we all share, I think he means that we all share this need to allow otherness into our lives, to be challenged by the other, so that we can develop as individuals, mm-hmm. and so that we can avoid becoming one-sided.
Would you say that we all have this division within ourselves?
Sure. And yes, so I mean, everybody knows what it's like to be conflicted about something. I mean, that's certainly comes with the territory, I think. But I think, to develop what I was saying, I mean, the way the point is that the easy thing to do is to always have an answer to that question. Mm-hmm. So yes, one has a sense, well, I could do that or I could do that, but there's always, one tends to head in the direction that's most comfortable. Whereas if what Jung did, or was forced to do, really, because of what he was presented with as a child, was to really acknowledge that there was something else within him, as it were. So, I mean, in a way, what we're talking about is the division between conscious and unconscious, because the unconscious is also part of us, but it presents us with things that we don't necessarily want to be aware of, or presents us with lines of thinking that we don't want to go down, or lines of it's often challenging the unconscious, and that's necessary to remind us that we aren't just one thing, because as soon as we acknowledge that there is this other world, there is this other sort of dimension of our psyche, which we could call the unconscious, mm-hmm. then as soon as we're in touch with that, we start meeting these other inner figures, and the other inner figures that Jung met and describes in the Red Book, but which he then goes on to develop as and give the names of shadow, anima, wise old man, all these other sort of inner figures who he itemizes, and who we all have the capacity to be in touch with within us. So again, these are figures who are very much not our normal ego mm-hmm. self, and a meeting with these figures can be and often is challenging, mm-hmm. but it's exactly that kind of challenge that Jung encourages us to accept and to take on, because that's the only way to develop a kind of broader, more holistic psyche.
Yeah, these inner figures. And I was wondering if you would say a little bit about how Jung and Jungian analysts don't pathologize these things. And I had a very long road to get to my own Jungian analysis. And that is, I think, the main thing that attracted me to it and allowed me to stay with it is that my analyst, she would not diagnose me. She didn't pathologize anything I brought to the table. Anything I brought into the room was not looked at in that way. And that allowed me to accept those things and work with those things. And they weren't medicated away. So would you say something about about the argument that Jung was schizophrenic or he was, crazy? And
yeah, I mean, in terms of what you just said, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that has to be that kind of acceptance of everybody just as they are is absolutely crucial. And because the pathologizing perspective is the perspective of, from an individual point of view, is the perspective of the ego, and writ large, it's the perspective of the kind of normalizing, institutionalizing kind of aspect of our culture that says this is normal and this is not. And that's absolutely, it's very much, it's impossible not to be affected by that, of course. But as you say, it's incredibly refreshing to find oneself in a therapeutic relationship where everything is accepted, that there is nothing is dismissed or considered to be less than who you are. So that's absolutely necessary. Yes, in terms of Jung and the pathologizing of Jung, I have really, I think there are two aspects to this. One is that it seems to me that someone who describes himself as having, in the period where some people would tell us that he had a kind of psychotic breakdown, i.e. the period of the Red Book, and in the wake of the split with Freud. Now, of course, that was an extremely challenging time for him, and it was a very difficult time. There's no questioning that. But it doesn't make sense to me to describe that as a psychotic breakdown. I've dealt with clients who have been through psychotic breakdowns, and we're not talking about people who could maintain a normal working life during the day and then go off and have dreams and visions at night. It doesn't work that way. He's very clear in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He kept up a perfectly normal working life throughout this period. And indeed, it was absolutely essential for him to do that, to maintain his feet on solid ground, as it were, so that he could then go and explore the unconscious the rest of the time. So it doesn't make any sense for me, on the one hand, to even describe that as any form of psychosis. But the other side of that is that it tends to be used as a way to dismiss what Jung was doing.
Yes.
That's just not helpful, because what he was doing was exploring this whole world of otherness and allowing these, making a space, as it were, emptying a stage for these figures to come onto them and for him to meet them and learn from them. And he was, going out of his way to make sure that his ego didn't dominate, didn't insist on what the way things were, and so he allows this stuff to come out of the unconscious. Now he doesn't just lie down, as it were, and let it be. He doesn't say, the unconscious is here. I'll bow down to it, and it will tell me exactly how things are. If you read the Red Book, he's constantly arguing with these figures. He's engaging with them. So it's a very much a kind of to and fro process. And again, to bring it back to the two personalities, it seems to me this is the place where you see him getting to the point where the two personalities are not just coexisting, they're actually interrogating each other, they're working on each other, they're, the tension, the contradictions between them are being worked out. And he comes out of the whole experience a different person from the person he went in. And that's why that then becomes the kind of his model for individuation. But there's nothing, there's nothing pathological about that. It could have gone, and he's very clear about this. He says if he hadn't done this, if he hadn't allowed these figures to come up, if he hadn't talked to them and allowed all this to happen, then he would have been in trouble. Because then he'd have been repressing something that needed to happen. That's so. I think the point he makes really very clearly is that what's pathological here is not having a multiplicity within your psyche. That's just the way it is. We all have the capacity to connect with all sorts of different aspects of ourselves. That's just there. What's pathological is when those parts can't speak to each other, when there's no contact between them, where one is split off, compartmentalized, separated from the other, and then you start getting into trouble. That's what that's when things go wrong, and that's at the point where either you're getting into a kind of neurotic situation where certain unconscious things come through in what seems to the ego to be a annoying and frustrating way, or even worse, the unconscious bursts through and overwhelms the psyche, in the case of psychosis. But clearly there are such things as pathological experiences. But this is what happens when one doesn't allow for exactly the sort of multiplicity within the psyche that Jung was encouraging.
So what would you tell people who might be listening to this and are recognizing that very thing within themselves and don't know what to do with it?
Yes, well, it's very frightening, of course, to as it were become aware of something within you that you don't know, I think one of the great examples of this is hearing voices, and of course within the kind of medical model, this is a classic sign of something going horribly wrong. But I think the truth is that and I've read some research on this, that an enormous number of people often hear voices, as it were, and often reply to those voices and have inner conversations or even outer conversations when they're on their own, without it being a pathological event. It doesn't mean they're mad. Doesn't mean they're going to go mad. It just means that they're in touch with something within themselves. And the whole process of what Jung eventually calls active imagination is really just that. It's a conversation. It's an inner conversation you have with something within you. These are relatively normal kind of ways of dealing with things, and so nobody should be afraid to allow the otherness within, as it were, to come up, if you can allow that to be there. And I'm not saying that you should be allowed up to overwhelm things, but to be there enough to start a conversation with it. This, the crucial thing, is the kind of dialogical aspect of this. That you're, as it were, your ego, because Jung is very emphatic about this. The ego is only part of the psyche. It's the part that we tend to consciously experience our lives through, but it's not the whole picture. And so that's the part of one that through which one can make contact with these other parts, and then give them their voice and allow and try and hear what they have to say. Because in a way, this is what happens every night in our dreams. The ego part of ourselves is the sort of the figure of me. If I dream, the me in the dream, that's the ego. But I'm constantly meeting with all these other figures in dreams and talking to them, and all sorts of things are happening dramatically in terms of what plays out between us. And so this is perfectly normal. This is what occurs within the psyche all the time on one level. So we're just talking about bringing it more into consciousness, really, and finding out what this other part of oneself has to say for itself. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean, again, that you bow down before it and say, oh, well, I will always do what the unconscious has to say. It's a genuine dialogue. It's a genuine conversation. It's a negotiation, if you like.
And so you're referring here to the personal unconscious. What about the collective unconscious? How did that factor into Jung's personality number 2?
Well, I have trouble with this separating out the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, because it seems to me that it's not always, it's quite rarely easy to see. Theoretically there are these two different kind of regions, but in practice, I don't find it so much. So, for example, one has dreams in which say one dreams of someone that one knows, or of a family member, and or so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that the meaning of the dream is kind of reduced to the personal, the purely personal. I think that there's always an archetype, even however sort of ordinary, as it were, the setting of the dream may be, there's always an archetypal aspect to it, and vice versa. However apparently archetypal the dream may be, there's always, it's impossible to make sense of the dream if one doesn't introduce a personal aspect to it. So I tend to see, I think the work in working with dreams and psychologically generally is to see the personal through the archetypal and the archetypal through the personal, and to allow the two again to work on each other in a sense.
You mentioned that this theme of Jung's two personalities haunted everything he wrote.
Yeah, that's pretty well my thesis, really, and it shows up. I mean, just to start from the beginning, really. I mean, as I said earlier, the first book he wrote after the split with Freud is on psychological types, and if you look at there's the famous bit towards the end where he describes all the types one by one, but the vast majority of the book is looking at different aspects of culture and literature in which two different sides come up and offer different perspectives, and the way in which these perspectives contrast and conflict with each other. And that seems to me to be, he's taken this idea of these two different inner aspects, these two different personalities, and he's already finding, looking at the ways in which this shows up throughout literature and culture and the individual psyche. And then as the psychology goes on, I don't think there's any area of his psychology where the importance of bringing together the opposites, as I've said, doesn't come up. It just recurs again and again. It's absolutely central, for example, to his work with alchemy. The opposites are all, the work of alchemy is about bringing, it's about creating the conjunctio, as he calls it. And the conjunctio is the bringing together of the bride and the bridegroom, as it were. And this is the kind of imagery that you get in alchemy. But these are the opposites again. These are the two personalities, if you like, coming through in yet another form. So I don't want to reduce it to the notion. I'm not saying this is not a kind of reductive biographical point. I'm not saying that everything in Jung psychology came about just because he had this experience as a young person. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that the way in which he dealt with that particular tension in childhood was hugely influential in terms of where the ways in which he approached and the problems that he saw occurring in the development of the psyche. Mm-hmm. And of course, the other thing is one has to remember that although in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he's talking about his experience as a child in the book, when he's talking about the two personalities, he's writing the book at the very end of his life. So he's looking back over. He's well aware of the development of his own psychology. And my feeling is that what he's doing there, in a way, he's offering that story of the two personalities as a kind of fable almost, to illustrate, to help us understand this kind of central red thread that runs through his psychology and what it's about and what it goes back to and how it connects. Mm-hmm. And it offers a kind of lens, in a way, to go back to the psychology and see how it all coheres, because I think that this is, in a way, because it is in effect the idea of individuation. The idea of individuation is that you allow the opposites to come together, and that moves you on to the next level, and then the same process happens again, and that moves you on to the next level, and so forth. This, what he calls the transcendent function, is this process whereby one incorporates and allows for and dialogues with the opposites, and eventually in a sort of irrational way, something. You open up into the next level, and you begin to be able to see things in a different way, and that process is the central process in his psychology. I think all the other aspects of it, the complexes, the archetypes, typology, alchemy, synchronicity, they all fall into place as ways in which this central process can be illustrated, ways in which it is seen to be working, as it were.
So if somebody hears this, bring the opposites together, would you give us an example of, I know we've been talking about that this whole time, but what would you say to somebody that is aware of these opposites within and says, well, what do you mean bring them together? What am I supposed to do? Yeah,
well, I think the first thing is that it tends not to work that way, in as much as the opposites. This is a process which tends to happen. It's already happening before you notice it, as it were. So you don't need the problem is already there, in a sense. So first of all, you're presented with a problem. So the most kind of simplest example I can come up with is the problem of shadow. Mm-hmm. And everybody, is aware of the fact that there are aspects of our personality and parts of ourselves that we're not entirely pleased with, that we don't really want other people to know about, we're a bit ashamed of, we don't really like, we'd rather they weren't there, and so on and so forth. And we've all had dreams where we're persecuted by some person or some monster or something or some nameless dread or whatever, and these are all in one form or another the way that the shadow works, and the shadow presents itself to us as a problem, as it were. And I think what Jung is saying that rather than in the dream, the tendency tends to be to run away from these, or you try and close all the doors and windows. This horrible thing that's trying to get in, you try and keep it out. Or if you're outside and you're being followed by something, you try and run away, you try and escape. And of course, that's exactly what the ego always wants to do. It wants to get away from this threatening thing, whatever it is. But if you can find a way to stop, turn around, and engage this thing in the kind of dialogue and negotiation that we've been talking about, that begins a process of opening oneself up to allowing the possibility that there might be something here which is not just negative. See, that's one needs to move beyond the notion that you need to protect yourself against this horrible negative thing, because the paradox here is that what you're trying to protect from this desperately needs it. That what comes from the unconscious is exactly what the ego always needs. It's just that it resists it like hell. It really doesn't want to know about this, and it doesn't want to be presented with it because it's a threat to the ego. To the control of the ego, if you like, and so in this case, the opposite comes in the form of the shadow, and there, what Jung suggests is not that we allow ourselves to be taken over by shadow, but that if we can start to negotiate, start to talk to shadow, start to allow it to be there a bit, to find out what it wants, if you like. If this was a fairy tale, you'd be asking it, what do you want? What's your goal here? What are you looking for? And then you're beginning to open yourself up to the idea that there might be something in this shadow that has something to offer. Mm-hmm. That can, and once you take on that aspect of this new perspective, that changes the way you are, changes the way you act in the world. So just to give a very brief example, in the case of shadow, it may be, for example, that one is, for all sorts of familial or cultural reasons, terrified of anger, and you do your best to avoid situations where anyone's angry, and the last thing you want to be is angry because you think it's terribly destructive. Maybe you had childhood experiences where it was terribly destructive. But eventually, if you can get to the point where you can start allowing a bit of anger into your life, you find that it's exactly what you need, because we all need to be able to utilize and employ anger at the right moments and in the right way, because it gives us a bit of ballast in life. It gives us a bit of three-dimensionality in our dealings with the world and with people. And so that's the kind of way in which you see the perspective gets changed by the introduction of the opposite and allowing it in and that process widens out, broadens, opens up our psyche.
I would like to go back to something you had said earlier in chapter 4 of your book. Again, the name of the book is Two Souls, Alas, Jung's Two Personalities and the Making of Analytical Psychology. It was published in 2019 by Chiron. In chapter 4, you look at Jung's relationships with a series of women, and you had mentioned that earlier. I was wondering if you would say a little bit more about that. I know that there's a lot of interest and a little bit of confusion around the various women that Jung had in his life. Why did you write about that in this book?
Yeah, well, I didn't. I mean, the danger here is that one kind of lumps all these women in together, and obviously, although they're very, very different people. I mean, the women in question are really who I look at in the chapter are, first of all, the Jung's cousin Helena Preiswerk, who was when he was, I think, at university, she was 15 years old, and she had a certain amount of ability as a medium, and Jung was fascinated by this and arranged all sort of seances with her, and eventually the whole thing fell to pieces, but it was an extremely important event for Jung, and he later wrote it up as his doctoral dissertation.
Yeah.
And the relationship with Helena Preiswerk is the first relationship I look at. Then there's another important relationship. Now I'm aware of the fact that the relationship with his wife, I don't include in this particular list of relationships. Mm-hmm. And I could talk at length about this, but just this is in no way is that am I kind of diminishing Emma Jung, who was obviously a crucially important figure in his life. But there's something about that particular erotic connection that was developed with a series of women that I concentrate on here. And the second of these women was Sabine Spielrein, who famously Jung either did or did not have an affair with. In the film version, he did, and that's the version everyone likes to know about. But right. It's not conclusively proved that was the case. But nonetheless, he clearly had a very intimate relationship with her. Then there was a much less well-known woman called Maria Moltzer, who was in the Jung circle around the time of the First World War and before. And then finally, Toni Wolff, who did become Jung's mistress, mm-hmm. And who was an extremely important figure in around the time of the Red Book. And what I do in this chapter is look closely at the actual outer relationships, as it were, that Jung maintained with these women, and which are all fascinating. In nearly every case, obviously not in the case of Helena Price work, but in the other cases, they all start as patients of Jung's, but then they develop into a rather different kind of relationship. And where there's enormous intimacy, often a great degree of mutuality and reciprocity. In several of these cases, Jung there seems to have been something going on, which was almost as if the kind of therapeutic relationship was reversed, and at various times these women acted as an analyst to Jung and allowed him to work on his stuff through them, as it were. Now, there's not a vast amount of material to work on with some of these women, but there's enough, I think, to see a certain pattern emerging. But what I was, and there's no question these women were all extremely important to him, and they all had their own abilities and were original in their own way, and developed their own ideas. Sabine Spielrein's ideas were sort of neither Freudian nor Jungian in a way, and she became quite an important figure in her own right later on. But at this stage, she was kind of taking Jung's ideas and working them through and bringing them back to Jung and changing them. And Jung certainly, and he was quite upfront about this in a letter that he later wrote to her. He explained that she'd enabled him, and the relationship with her had enabled him to understand certainly crucial psychological things that otherwise he wouldn't have been able to do. And really with these other women too, that a similar kind of thing seems to have happened, and I think this is fascinating, and I think that. But what's clearly going on is there's a complete intertwining of the personal relationship between them and a kind of development of a kind of theoretical ideas around it, psychological ideas. So the development of his psychology and the development of his relationships are very closely intertwined together there. Which is, in a way not altogether surprising, but what is slightly disappointing in a way is that Jung never really acknowledges the importance of these relationships when he finally develops the ideas and puts them into the collected works and so on. He will acknowledge a little bit. He acknowledges that Maria Moltzer, for example, influenced the way he came up with the idea of the intuitive function in typology. So he doesn't completely ignore them, but on the whole, there's very little acknowledgement of how important they were, and it seems to me that this is interesting not just because it's important that male scientific discoverers should acknowledge the women in their lives, which is certainly true and historically hasn't been done enough, but more importantly, it points to us a kind of one-sidedness in the direction of the inner development of things and the emphasis on the inner in Jungian psychology. I think Jung was an introvert by nature, and he tended to be much more at home in that world than he was in the outer world, and that means he was more at home in a way with personality number 2, as I described it, than he was with personality number 1. And I think what he tended to do was almost take advantage of these relationships and utilize them for his own purposes.
I wonder if perhaps it's because those relationships were private. They were deeply personal and they were private. And I wonder if maybe he didn't speak about them much because of that.
I'm sure that's true. And there's no question. I mean, and for example, with Tony Wolff, there are other important factors, such as the fact his family, didn't want the world to know about his relationship with Tony Wolff. So clearly, there are all sorts of other reasons as well. And that's certainly true. And what I would never expect from Jung is that he details the personal, private aspects of any of these relationships. But I think one of the important factors in Jungian psychology is that I think, as Sonu Shamdasani, the historian of Jungian psychology, has described it, Jung uses his personal experiences. They're paradigmatic for him. They're exemplary. All his ideas come from his personal experiences, and the way in which those experiences develop, therefore, is very important in terms of understanding the ideas themselves. And what I think is a pity is that he doesn't acknowledge how. Again, I'm not expecting him to detail personal or private details, but I think what would be helpful would be to hear from him that one can achieve important psychological developments through outer relationships, because one can sometimes get the impression that individuation is a purely inner process, and that you do on your own, and then you come back to your relationships. Whereas it seems crucial to emphasize how important outer relationships can. Of course, and it should be obvious, because it's the outer relationship with the therapist that is so important in terms of Jungian therapy. Yeah. So it's, there's nothing particularly surprising there, but it would be nice to hear that a bit more from Jung, I think.
I can't see myself without others. And
exactly.
And very difficult relationships in my life are the most valuable thing I've ever had, as far as my personal development. Yeah, I think, and I think that's absolutely right. And of course, there are places where Jung does exactly say things a bit like that. So it's not that he never says that. It's just that the general tendency is sometimes gives the impression that if you want to individuate, you just go away to a room somewhere on your own and commune with your inner stuff, and then later you go back and go back to the world. And it's just not like that. Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed in this episode. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, TuneIn, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. You can also listen to this episode on your Amazon Echo device simply by saying, "Alexa, play Speaking of Jung on Apple Podcasts," or TuneIn. Just be sure to pronounce Jung with a hard J. So with special thanks to Chiron Publications, Steve Buser, and Murray Stein, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.